In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 All of us grow old. Every day, every hour, we're growing a little bit older. And hopefully we're not just growing older. Hopefully we're actually growing wiser, more mature, with more experience, more ability to really navigate this world. One of the most important elements, I think, of real maturity is understanding our limits. I can remember being 15 or 16 years old and thinking that, I pretty much knew everything. I pretty much could do anything. If I just tried hard enough, I could do it. I was very confident of myself. And I think a lot of 15 and 16-year-olds tend to think that they kind of know everything. Of course, it didn't take long of actually getting out and having to work and pay rent and actually navigate the world and all of its complexity and all of its brokenness. I began to realize, there was a lot I did not know. There was a lot that I couldn't do. We have to accept our limits. We have to accept that we're not actually in control of a whole lot of what happens to us and what happens around us. The call to be a disciple of Jesus is not a call to pretend that we're somehow in control of everything. Being a disciple of Jesus doesn't mean that we think that we have magical or miraculous powers to just do whatever we want, or that we can know everything we might want to know. A huge part of being a disciple of Jesus is actually just the opposite. Recognizing our smallness, our limitedness, recognizing that we're not in control, and choosing to use the freedom we do have to respond to God's call and to be faithful to who God calls us to be. Not always to seek what we might want for ourselves, but to actually respond to God's call. Now today, in the midst of this pandemic, this epidemic, I don't think we need that many more reminders that we're not in control. This disease is spreading. It's causing deep anxiety and fear and indeed death all around us. And although we're all, I hope, taking every step we can to keep ourselves and each other safe, we know that ultimately we're not in control of this situation. No one really is. When Jesus gathered his disciples for a meal nearly 2,000 years ago, I think he was really trying to get this message across. Now, that Last Supper, where Jesus instituted the Eucharist, has a range of meanings, a depth of meaning. But as I've reflected on the Last Supper this last week or so, it's been this message. Facing the lack of control that I feel, I see Jesus trying to get his disciples ready for the fact that they're not in control. Gathering for food is something that we humans do so often that we take it for granted. But eating is an act that, if we pay attention, tells us a huge amount about ourselves. To eat food is to accept our dependence. Our dependence. When I eat a piece of bread today, there was someone else who farmed it, who harvested it, who packaged it, who drove it. Someone else put it on the grocery shelf so that I could show up and buy it one day. To eat a piece of bread, a simple act, I depend on dozens, maybe hundreds, thousands of other people, their work, their labor, their attention, their skill. And to eat food actually drives an even deeper dependence. Because I have to recognize that I have to eat, I have to drink just to live. I'm dependent on this constantly being available to me, or my life won't last that long. Last of all, to eat is to realize that we depend on this huge world that we live in. We depend on healthy environments and ecosystems in order to eat. I need sun and water and soil in pretty large amounts in order to get the food I need to survive. We are dependent. Gathering the disciples around this table and sharing a meal, Jesus was, among many other things, telling them, look, you aren't in control. You depend on others, other farmers, workers, bakers. You depend on so many people around you. You depend on the land that you live on and the land beyond where you live. Ultimately, of course, the message is we all depend on God. The The work of being a disciple of Jesus is the work of turning and accepting that we need God's grace in order to really live as the people we're actually called to be. We have to depend on each other, and we have to depend on God. We're not in control. And I also think this is part of why Jesus stoops down and washes the disciples' feet. Yes, it's an act of service, and Jesus is trying one last time to remind his disciples that in addition to his teaching, all his other work was serving the physical needs of other people. Yes, we should remember that message. But washing someone's feet is also a sign of this dependence. We depend on each other. We need each other to survive in this world. And we need God's grace if we're really going to be everyone we're called to be, everything we're called to be. We need God's grace. Now, traditionally, Maundy Thursday is a time where we gather together and we share the Eucharist and we wash one another's feet to remember the Last Supper. And as another reminder of the ways in which we are not in control, we can't do that. We can't gather together and share a meal. We can't gather to wash one another's feet. We have to maintain social distancing. Even our liturgy is being reshaped in radical and unexpected ways by this crisis. But we are gathered together here. Not physically, but nevertheless, we're gathered together. Not in space, but in time together. We still have an opportunity to gather in fellowship, to understand and to recognize how much we depend on each other, and to try to teach each other how much we already depend on God and how much more we ought to depend on God.